Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm so grateful to be joined by Dr. BJ Fogg, who is the founder of the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford University. In addition to his research, he teaches industry innovators how human behavior really works, and he created the Tiny Habits Academy to help people around the world. He lives currently in Northern California and Maui, splits his time between both, and really his work is foundational in behavior design and habit science. A lot of the best-selling books that are out on the market right now depend and rely and refer to his work as the foundations of what they cover in their books and studies. So welcome to the program, BJ.
Hey, Charles, thank you for having me. I'm super happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I'd love to get started and just kind of ask you about what got you interested in behavior design and habit science. Did it happen early on?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to childhood, I was raised in a home and a culture that was all about optimizing. That's within the framework of Stephen Covey and Clay Christensen and all part of this Mormon culture where it was like, set goals and become a better you and all that. So I really grew up in this. I didn't think it was unusual. And then academically, as I moved on, I got really interested in language and the power of language, but mostly to influence good behavior. And then one thing led to another, and I became an experimentalist, like a behavior scientist that runs experiments, so a quantitative method away from the humanities and away from linguistics and quantitative linguistics, but always in the service. So as I look at the history, it was always in the service of how do we help ourselves and others be happier and healthier? And that really comes down to behavior change in so many ways.
Well, that's great. And I completely agree. So isn't behavioral design all about habit design? Can you differentiate the two for us? Because I think a lot of people think that they're one and the same.
Yeah. So in my lab about 2010, we renamed my Stanford lab to be the Behavior Design Lab. Okay. At the time, nobody was using behavior design or behavioral design. And we thought it was unique, but it ends up that people started using the phrase behavioral design and so on to mean, I don't know, a more convenient name for designing for behavior change. When we talk about behavior design in my lab, in my work, it's a specific set of models that I'm sure we'll talk about and a specific set of methods. Okay, so it's a systematic way of thinking, systematic way of designing under the umbrella of what I and we call behavior design. Now, it can apply to any type of behavior. Habits are one type of behavior. So if I wrote on this blackboard here, and I won't, in a big circle is the word behavior. In a smaller circle is the word habit. So habits are a type of behavior. But another type of common behavior is a one-time action. Like you inviting me to this podcast was a one-time action and me saying yes. So I'm not doing this habitually. We're doing this one time. Me storing some books right here and organizing the books is a one-time action. Now, putting the books back in the right place might be a habit, but there is a one-time action. So that is a type of behavior. So habits are a subset of the larger category of behaviors. And they always, any behavior type, whether it's starting a habit, stopping a habit, doing a one-time action, will always come down to motivation, ability, and prompt. So that model, I suspect we'll talk about, applies to all types. But habits is a specific type that is about a behavior you do quite automatically. So when you're thinking about designing for habits, you're thinking about the other components, but you're also thinking, how do we reinforce this behavior so it becomes quite automatic? So people do it without deciding, without thinking very much.
Yeah, thank you for providing that distinction. And for our listeners to really think of that as a type of a larger picture, right, of behavior design is the habit design. Because you identified 35 different behavior types. Then you kind of whittled it down to 15 ways to change behavior. And it's a nice framework, but you can't use it for design very well.
Right.
But it shows kind of where habits fit into that overall structure, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And so thank you for doing the background work on this. If people want to see the academic paper on 35 different ways behaviors can change your habits, you can search, I call it the behavior grid, even back then. that academic publication is nice and it's fine, but it's not practical for design. And it turns out just to be too complicated for most uses. So I then condensed it, like you said, to 15 different ways behaviors can change. And 10 of those 15 relate to habits. So if you go
That's
to behaviorgrid.org, you'll see the 15. And it's not that useful for design. It's kind of like a periodic table of elements. It's nice to know. But if you're designing a new, let's say, a new soup recipe, you're not looking at the periodic table of elements. You might use it for analysis, but you wouldn't use it for design. Same thing with the behavior grid.
that is true, but we'll have that in the show notes just in case people want to refer to that. Love to kind of go into now more of a practical framework and kind of that model that you have that is so useful. And the first step that I always hear a lot of people of is that they know what to do, but they don't do it. And it speaks to that information action
Yeah.
fallacy, that just because you know what to do, just because you know what it takes to lose weight, to give more exercise, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to do it. Why is there a disconnect in
Yeah.
this piece
I'm
of the
gonna
model?
I'm gonna push back a little bit on this. I know you know this, Charles, but just to clarify for people watching and listening, people may think they know what to do. Oh, I've got to limit my carb intake. I've got to eat more leafy greens. But those aren't actually behaviors. Those are more like I call them aspirations. They're general types of behaviors. They're not specific behaviors. So to eat fewer carbs, that what is the specific thing you do? Well, you would say no to bread at the restaurant. You would not buy crackers and bring them home. You would, et cetera. So you break it down into very specific behavior. So I think from the outset, one of the problems that people have with good intentions trying to influence their own behavior or others is they stay in that abstract level of eat fewer carbs or eat more leafy greens or exercise more. None of those are specific behaviors. So first you got to get down to being really specific, and then you can start designing for that behavior.
And I think that's a lot of the issue with New Year's resolutions, because this episode's going to air close to the beginning of the new year. And
Yeah.
I find that those same issues with those types of wishes, right, that we have in the new year is that very vague, high level, that
Yeah.
aspiration or outcome, but you don't quantify it by identifying those observable behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. Let me give an example from my own life. About a month ago, I decided I'm going to read more. Okay. And I'm going to read stuff that is not nonfiction, work related, academic. Okay. Right? So I end up reading a lot, but it's not like novels or leisurely stuff because I probably don't have to explain why many of us have this problem. So I thought, okay, I want to read more. That's the abstraction. The specific was, well, what am I going to read and how am I going to read it? When am I going to read it? So I decided to buy a Kindle, which really, I thought, okay, I'm going to read on Kindle, not on this or not in a book and so on. And I picked some specific fiction books that I wanted to read. And I designated specifically when I was going to read those. So I went from that abstract thing, like read more stuff that doesn't relate to my work, down to the specific behavior, including the technique and the content that I was going to tackle. And that kind of specificity for many things, maybe not for everything, but for many things, changes the game between not doing it and just being frustrated, like, oh, I didn't read more, to actually reading more, which I am doing. And it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird to read stuff that's not work related, but I'm liking it.
That's great. And we're going to get more into this model right now. So you say that behavior happens when three things happen. So if you could unpack that a little bit for our listeners, that would be great.
Three things: to motivation to do the behavior, ability, and prompt. So it's MAP: motivation, ability, prompt. And each of those are different components, but when they all come together, behavior happens. One way to think about it is like fire. Fire happens when you have fuel and you have air, oxygen, and you have a spark. And when all those three things come together, fire can happen. If you're missing any one of those things, the fire won't happen. If you have no oxygen, it won't happen. If you have no spark, it won't happen. If you have no fuel, it won't happen. So that's the same way to think about this model. You've got motivation, ability, prompt. When they converge at the same moment, the behavior can happen. If any piece is missing, the behavior won't happen.
Now, many people think that you should start with motivation. Why is that the wrong place to start?
Well, yes and no. um, it depends on the type of behavior. The way you design for one-time actions is different than habits. And Charles, I've worked together and you've trained with me, so you know this, and you know that within the limited time frame, I won't be able to pack all of this. But let me answer your question. For habits, if you're designing for habits for yourself and others, you actually do start with motivation, but it's you pick a behavior that you're already motivated to do. Okay. So if it's like, oh, I want to read more, don't get specific and say, oh, okay, I'm going to read Chaucer. I hate Chaucer, but I'm going to read Chaucer. Okay. I think Chaucer's kind of cool. I'm just using that as a weird example. So you pick something that a behavior that you already want to do. So the motivation is attached to the behavior already. The mistake is to pick something you don't want to do, like reading Chaucer, and then trying to tack on or somehow pour the motivation sauce over it later. That's a big mistake when trying to create habits for yourself or others.
Well, and that's something that people look at, and a lot of time they are identifying behaviors they really don't want to do. And one of your first maxims is help people to do what they already want to do. So you're right. You got to be motivated to do it, but don't focus on that piece. And really, the first step is what we kind of talked about already. Identify that aspiration or outcome that you really want to do and
Yeah.
get clarity around it. But don't
Yes.
make it too specific from the beginning. So let's pick an example, and maybe work through just an overview of the model. Let's say for the new year, we want to lose some weight or we want to get exercise, right? We want to be healthier in terms of just doing more exercise. So that would be a good aspiration, correct? To have going into it. It's not too specific, but
Yeah.
it's big enough to where you can both identify some behaviors around it.
Yeah, maybe. So now you're having me put on sort of my health dietitian hat, and that's not really me. But I've been in this space enough to know that exercise is not a very good tool for the weight loss. So if you're really shooting for weight loss, design for changing your eating behavior. Okay. So first and foremost, you got to make sure that the behaviors you're going into will lead to the outcome you want. So first you've got to line up what are the behaviors that will help me reach this outcome. And let's kind of change it a little bit. Let's say somebody wants to sleep better
Okay.
because physical activity, I believe, does contribute to that. So of all the different ways you could sleep better, one-time actions like get a better bed, and one-time actions like put in blinds to block the light, and one-time action buy a sound masking machine. Those are one-time actions. You could also do things like magnesium, that would be habits, and so on. And one of them would be physically active during the day, right? And so now would it be lifting heavy weights or would it be more kind of low grade cardio? And I'm guessing it's the second, it's a guess here, but like you're indicating, you start with here's what I really want. I want to sleep better. And then you break it down into what behaviors will help me achieve that. And then you pick among those, I mean, there's 20, maybe 50 different ways, things you could do to help you sleep better. Among those, which ones are the best match? And I call those golden behaviors or golden habits. So you pick the ones that you want to do, you pick the ones that you can do, and you pick the ones that are going to have impact. Impact's important, because if you pick something like, I'm going to watch TV late at night that's going to help me sleep better, that may have the opposite effect. So you've got to make sure that behavior is having impact in the direction that you want. So the three components of a good match for a golden behavior or golden habit are you want to do it. Don't pick something you don't want to do. You can do it, and it will have impact in taking you to the outcome that you want.
And first, you want to make sure that you identify enough behaviors. So you don't want to stress yourself out by finding, what's the ideal behavior for me to do at this one point in time, but kind of look at it, brainstorm about it.
Yeah.
You have different terminology around that, but just to get enough of that magic wanding experience done. So then you can focus map on the behaviors that you've identified and find those golden behaviors, like you said, that have the impact that your ability is of such that you can do them and you're motivated to do them as well.
Right. For most of the objectives we have, what people would often call goals, there's a whole bunch of different actions or habits you could do that would take you there. There's not just one. Like sleeping better, there's a whole bunch of different options. me reading more. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. I could have decided to listen to audiobooks. I could have decided to read the books, physical books I already own. There's a whole bunch of ways. So, like you said, explore the many, many options and don't just settle on the first thing that comes to mind. Like if it were that easy, like the first thing that come to mind, you probably would have solved this years ago. It's sleeping more or sleeping better, reading more. So behavior design is a process. It's a systematic process where you're not guessing at the best new habits. You are systematically deriving those. Okay. So, and that's important because when you just guess, like, oh, what's going to help me lose weight or what's going to help me read more, that's just a guess. You didn't systematically figure out the best thing or the best set of behaviors.
And the nice thing about the process too is it's an iterative process. So as you're trying these and some of the things don't work, you have checkpoints along the way. Well, let's try to make it easier. Let's
Yeah.
try to find different prompts. So it's not that you have this onus that you have to get it right the first time. You're likely, like you said, not going to get it right, but there are ways in which to improve the outcomes or the probability of success as you go through the process.
Yep. And in the tiny habits world, so I started teaching tiny habits in 2011 after doing it a year on my own. And I've personally coached through email over 60,000 people. And then we have tiny habits coaches and so on who are available. You can work with them. And we still have a free 5-day program people can take. In the tiny habits world, we call that practice and revise. So you put something into practice, and if it's not working, you revise it. And if it is working, you keep going. But if it's not, you revise it. And that is not a failure. It's part of the method. That revision, iteration is part of the method. And that really takes a big burden off a lot of people who think, oh, I'm going to set a goal and then I have to be perfect at achieving the goal or somehow I'm flawed. Every single one of those things is not the best way to do it, right? You come up through design the best new habits. It could be more than one. You design it into your life and then you put it into practice and you iterate if needed. Okay, notice that's radically different than the idea of I'm going to write this thing on a poster and I got to be perfect and I'm going to check it every day. And if I miss any day, I'm a failure, right? That's not how you succeed or progress in changing your behavior or anybody else's for the long term. That will work temporarily, right? But in the long term, that does not work very well.
Well, that's great advice. So you talked a lot about individual behavior change. How do we change the behaviors of groups or tribes?
Ooh. I gave a keynote about a month ago and I didn't have time to answer this particular question. So I recorded a video to answer and I sent it to the organization. It's a 10-minute video because there's a systematic way to think about it. And one is some of the dimensions. So again, behavior change is a system, everybody. You can think about it systematically. And the dimensions to think about here in terms of the group is, do we want everybody to do the same behavior or are they doing a bit different behaviors? So within an employee wellness context, you might say, no, we want everybody to do the walking challenge. Or you might say, no, we want everybody to do whatever physical activity they want to do, right? Pick your own behavior. And then the other cross-cutting, and it ends up being a 2x2, is do we want just anybody to join the walking challenge or do we need everybody to do it? The first one's more like a startup. Hey, here's this app. Anybody can use it. Sign up. We don't care who first million, 5 million here use it. The second one is more like employee wellness or community health, where we have a population and we need to help that population be more physically active or share knowledge more or be more creative, right? And so it ends up being a 2x2 when you map those out. And then the way you design for each of those 4 quadrants is different. So now I'll give you the simple version. So that's the sophisticated, that's the right systematic way. The simple answer is be very specific about what you want people to do and make it really easy. Okay. That's just a good general approach to anything. So I'm pretty confident that if people don't want to geek out or study with me or dig into my work or get into that 2x2 framework and just want a shortcut, the shortcut is be very clear and specific about the behavior and make it really easy for people to do. Simplicity changes behavior. It's the most powerful, I think, influence technique there is make it really easy.
That's great advice. You've also mentioned in the past having like a destination group, right? Which is kind of that community that's already doing what you aspire
Yeah.
to do. So you can get involved with that, or a journey group where you join other novices on that same journey with you to help inspire, motivate, and keep you moving along.
Yeah. And so it was work in my Stanford lab about 5 or 6 years ago, where we looked at how to help people change together. So we called the project Change Together. And it turns out there are patterns for doing this. And one is whether you use a destination group or a journey group. Destination means you're joining people that have already achieved it. Journey group is like, we're all figuring it out together. And one or the other depends in part on how complex the behavior is.
Mm.
If it's a super simple behavior, then you can just join other peers, like let's say walking every day. You don't need a guide. You don't need a big coach. You don't need a lot of sophistication. Most people know how to walk. And so you help each other walk. Where if it's something like changing how you eat in a very specific way that has a lot of nuance and complexity, then you want probably a coach and to join a destination group, a group of people who are already eating in that way, because there's probably a lot of details and a lot of skills and other things that you need that you won't get from novices. And the novices essentially are the people in the journey group who are just like trekking along together, figuring it out. You want more of a destination group for those kinds of changes.
Thank you for providing that. How important are your coworkers, your friends, and on changing your behavior, and what role do they really play? Because there's some evidence that you are the combined total of the five people you spend the most time with. Is that
Yeah.
true? Or
I don't know if I mean, statements like that can be interpreted in lots of ways.
right?
But what I am confident in is that the people around us influence our behavior a lot and influence our behavior more than we care to admit. We're hugely influenced by the social world around us or the perceived social forces around us. And, we're social creatures. We're wired to be pack animals. We're wired to want to have status or acceptance in a group and to not get banished or low status in a group. And as such, and this is so powerful. This dynamic is so powerful that in the mid 90s, I ran laboratory experiments, like bringing people in the lab, and they worked with computers that they were led to believe that they were social actors and you were a teammate with this one or you were not a teammate. Okay. And this was a very rigorous study and people can find it. It's called Computers as Teammates. You can find it published in the 90s. And computers, our social wiring is so thoroughly embedded in us that when computers give us signals that they are social entities, we will behave in cooperative social-like ways with the computers, including changing our behavior. Even when it's just a computer. A lot of the people in the experiment were coders. They were technical people. These were not naive people. It's just that we're so deeply wired to be social and to behave in these kind of herd-like, pack-like ways that, yeah, absolutely. So one way to change your behavior for good is to find and join a group that is doing the behaviors you want and not hang out with the people who are doing the behaviors that you don't want. Now, I can say that easily, but that's in the real world pretty hard to do in a practical way. It's not impossible, but it's pretty hard. There are some ways to do that, and it's a great way to help move your life to where you want it to be, is hang out or somehow have a social connection with people who are doing the behaviors that you want to do.
Great advice. And I love that book that you did, Persuasive Technologies. I know it's somewhat dated now, but if you read that book and you look at what you've proposed, a lot of those things have already come to fruition. It's
People thought I was insane to be talking about how computers are going to influence our behavior. They just thought I was crazy because back then it was about user friendliness was the cutting edge thing. And it's like, no, okay, we're going to do this, but eventually this will be to influence people and change their behaviors. We're like, oh, you're insane, BJ. It's like, no, this is coming for better and worse. This is coming. So published that book, came out in 2002. And despite what the media says, it was a bestseller and big hit, it was not. Like the reception of the book was a gigantic yawn. Like nobody cared because they weren't. And it was like, hey, people, I'm pointing out the potentials and the pitfalls. We should be really worried this is coming. Now, people didn't get really worried until about 12 years after that. And now it's really hard to think of very many digital technologies that are not about influencing our behavior in some way. It's pervasive. Yeah.
You're right. Definitely ahead of your time, and more people should have been aware of that and listened to that, because it did happen, and it probably even happened on a greater scale than what you imagined. So as we reach the end of this episode, I love to leave our listeners with a call to action. What is a first step in behavior design that they could take today?
Buy the Tiny Habits book, but that's a huge one. Well, it's not buying it. It's actually reading it and applying it. But let me give a really simple, straightforward one that's free. Look at any behavior that you want to make more common in your life and spend 3 minutes saying, how do I make this easier to do? Explore. Don't worry about how do I motivate myself to do it more. That's just one component. Go to the ability. How do I make it easier? And list ways to make it easier. You don't have to spend 3 hours, 3 minutes. You might, in 30 seconds, have some great answers. And then start making it easier to do. And in that way, you could start playing around with your own behavior. In other words, being like a scientist of your own behavior. And you're going to see the power of, one, being deliberate in the design, and two, how simplicity changes behavior. So that's probably the simple, practical thing I would suggest. Yeah. And hopefully that then motivates you and inspires you to do the one-time action of buying the book, and then the habit of reading the book till you're done and applying it in your life widely. But I know that's a tall order.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and where they can get your best-selling book, Tiny Habits.
Well, the bjfogg.com is sort of like the dashboard for other things. And of course, you can get the book Tiny Habits anywhere they sell books, at your local bookstore if you can, right? Right. But again, that might be too hard to do. If nothing else, go to Audible and listen to the preface. So I had Audible move the preface, a special preface for the audio version, in front of the paywall, so you don't have to pay for it. And that will give you, and that's not in the printed book. I recorded but that'll give you a sense of me and give you a sense of why this book and why it matters. So that's pretty easy to do. So one, the general answer is bjfogg.com. Two, to drill down a little bit more about who I am and what's behind my work in ways that we didn't talk about today, Charles, I would say go to Audible and scroll down a little bit, and then my preface will be right there. It's about 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, BJ, for being on the program today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please go ahead and share this with your colleagues and friends and anyone else who might find this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, it can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and also be found on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into this topic and all the tips and tools that were shared. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. As always, you can head over to my LinkedIn page where you can see all the latest articles and posts from me. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called Single Servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. I look forward to serving you in the next episode, so hit subscribe and I'll see you then. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.